My nephew claimed I sat him. Now it was proven untrue. I made them pay for it. So here's the thing. I, 37F, have always been there for my family, especially my nephew. He's 13, and his dad, my brother, has had a rough go of it since my sister-in-law passed a few years back. I stepped in where I could, helped with expenses, made sure my nephew didn't go without. I never thought twice about it, honestly. Family's family. Right? Anyway, the day this all went down started like any other. I was heading home after a regular day at work, looking forward to putting my feet up and maybe watching some TV. But as soon as I walked through the door, I noticed something was off. My phone was ringing nonstop. I checked it and saw a few missed calls from my brother and some messages too, though none of them made much sense. He just kept saying, "You need to pick up. It's serious, and you're in trouble." No context, nothing. Now I'll admit, I brushed it off at first. I figured it was some drama with his finances or whatever. He'd been in and out of financial messes lately, and I'd had to bail him out before, so I ignored it. Figured I'd call him back later once I'd settled in. But then maybe an hour later, I got another call, but this time it was from a blocked number. I answered, figuring it was some scam call. But then the person on the other end said, "Hello. Is this my name? This is Detective so-and-so. We need you to come down to the station." That got my attention. I can't even explain the dread that crept up. It's that feeling where you know something's seriously wrong and you have no clue what it is, but your gut is just screaming at you. I asked what was going on, but they wouldn't tell me anything over the phone. Just insisted I come down as soon as possible. So I grabbed my keys and went straight to the station, trying to mentally run through every possible reason I could be there. But I couldn't come up with anything that made sense. When I got there, they led me into one of those cold, sterile rooms with a metal table and chairs, and the whole atmosphere made me feel like I was in some bad crime show. The detective sat down across from me, looking dead serious, and asked if I knew why I was there. I said no, but by that point, my mind was racing, trying to piece together what the hell was going on. Then she told me. She said my nephew had come forward with some serious accusations against me. I didn't understand at first, just blinked at her, trying to process. But when she repeated herself and explained exactly what he was claiming, I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. He was accusing me of something I wouldn't even repeat out loud, something that, honestly, made my skin crawl just hearing it. I was stunned, completely frozen in shock. My first instinct was to deny it, of course. I told the detective this had to be some kind of mistake, that I'd never do anything like that, and that I couldn't believe he'd say something so horrible. I mean, this was my nephew, a kid I'd practically helped raise since his mom passed. It just didn't make any sense. But here's the thing. The detective was looking at me like I was guilty right off the bat, like he'd already made up his mind. He said they'd already started an investigation and that things weren't looking good for me. Apparently, they'd talked to his father too, and he was fully supportive of his son. Hearing that stung, but it also confused the hell out of me. I mean, why would my brother just back this up? Where was all this even coming from? At that point, I was panicking. It's one thing to have someone make accusations behind your back. But to hear it from a detective while you're sitting there in an interrogation room, it's a whole other level of fear. He kept pressing, asking if I had anything to hide, if there was anything I wanted to come clean about. I was starting to feel like I was losing my mind, like this was all some sort of nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Eventually, he asked if they could search my house. He made it sound like I didn't have a choice, so I agreed. I mean, I had nothing to hide. And at that point, I just wanted to do whatever I could to prove my innocence. But the idea of them going through my home, combing through everything like I was some sort of criminal, made me sick. After hours of questioning and waiting around, they finally let me go, but they didn't really clear anything up. The detective just told me to stay available and that they'd be following up soon. I left that station in a daze, my mind spinning with questions I didn't have answers to. How did things come to this? Why would my nephew say something so awful? And what the hell was my brother thinking backing him up like that? When I got home, the reality hit me like a ton of bricks. This accusation could ruin my life, my job, my relationships, everything I'd worked for. It could all go down the drain because of a lie. I paced around my house replaying the day's events over and over, trying to find some kind of logic to it all, but I kept coming up blank. My nephew and I had never had issues. In fact, I thought we were close. I'd spent countless hours helping him, looking out for him, being there when he needed someone. It just didn't add up. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the detective's face, heard my nephew's accusation echoing in my head. The sheer unfairness of it all gnawed at me, and I kept swinging between anger and disbelief. How could family betray you like this? Why would someone I trusted do something so cruel? I kept thinking there had to be some explanation, some misunderstanding that could clear all this up. But deep down, a part of me was starting to fear the worst. My brother, his behavior, his willingness to back up this lie, something about it felt too calculated, too purposeful. It wasn't just a misunderstanding or a mistake. It was starting to feel like an attack, a targeted attempt to ruin me. The next morning, I called in sick to work, too drained and distracted to even pretend I could get through a normal day. And as I sat there staring blankly at my phone, I realized I had a choice to make. I could try to push through, pretend this was all going to blow over, or I could start fighting back, digging into why they were doing this and exposing the truth. I didn't know what I'd uncover, but I was ready to find out. After that nightmare interrogation, I was left totally wrecked. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on anything other than what my nephew had said about me. I was trying to make sense of it all, but every thought just led to more frustration and confusion. How could a kid I'd helped so much suddenly turn on me like this? And why would my brother, my late sister's husband, back him up on something so out of line? The worst part was that the police hadn't just brushed it off after he'd said it. They were taking him seriously, investigating me as if I'd actually done what he claimed. The entire situation felt insane. I was just sitting there in my own home, my life now under a cloud of suspicion. Everything around me felt different, like my whole house was tainted somehow. And I couldn't shake the feeling that something darker was going on here. Like, there was some missing piece to all this I couldn't see. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a kid saying something dumb. It felt planned, like there was a reason behind it. But what? Then out of nowhere, I got a call from the detective handling my case. He told me they needed to bring my nephew in for another interview, this time without his father present. That caught my attention. I didn't know why they'd separate them. But if the police were thinking something was fishy, that was a bit of a relief. It was like a tiny crack of hope that maybe this whole thing would get cleared up. I don't know what went on in that room during his second interview. All I know is that a couple of hours later, I got a call that changed everything. The detective sounded different, like he was suddenly on my side. He told me that my nephew had admitted to making the accusation up. I felt the air leave my lungs. He made it up. I mean, I wanted it to be false, obviously, since it was a lie. But hearing it confirmed was just something else. I felt a strange mix of relief, anger, and honestly, just pure betrayal. I asked him what he'd said, why he would lie like that, but he said he couldn't give all the details over the phone. All he told me was that his mom, my late sister's sister, had pressured him into it. Hearing that, I can't describe it. There's this saying, blood is thicker than water. Right? But in that moment, I felt like my own family had thrown me under the bus without a second thought. My sister-in-law had pushed her own son, her own kid, to lie and say that I'd done something unforgivable. For what? It didn't make any sense. When I met with the detective in person, he laid it all out. My nephew had confessed that his mom told him to make the accusation because they needed money, and my sister-in-law thought this would be an easy way to blackmail me. The entire plan was to force me into a corner where I'd be so scared of the damage to my reputation that I'd pay up, stay quiet, and save my own skin. I sat there stunned while he explained it. Every word was like a stab in the back. I'd always known that my brother had struggled with finances after my sister passed. That's why I'd stepped in so many times to help. Groceries, clothes for my nephew, a little extra here and there to make sure they were okay. And he turned that against me, weaponized it to try to squeeze even more money out of me. The detective explained that in his statement, my nephew said he tried to push back at first. He knew it was wrong, he said, and he was scared to do it. But his dad had told him that they had no other options, that this was the only way. Imagine that, a 13-year-old being told by his own father to do something so messed up because it was the only way. I was disgusted. I'd always thought I knew my brother. I mean, he's family. He married my sister, and when she passed, I felt like it was my duty to step in, to be there for them. But hearing how he manipulated his son into saying something that could destroy my entire life, I couldn't wrap my head around it. How desperate. How selfish do you have to be to put your kid through that? The detective asked if I had any idea he might be in such deep financial trouble. I told him honestly that he'd mentioned money issues a few times, but nothing ever that extreme. He was always vague about it, saying he might need a little help, that sort of thing. And, yeah, I'd helped him out before, but I had no idea he'd gotten to the point where he'd turn on me like this. I couldn't sit still. My hands were shaking, my mind racing. I kept thinking about all the times I trusted him, let him into my life, into my home. And now knowing he was capable of this level of betrayal, it was unreal. I'd heard of people backstabbing each other for money, but this was my family. I never thought it had happened to me, let alone from the people I'd been bending over backward to help. And then there was my nephew. I didn't know what to feel about him anymore. Part of me felt sorry for him. He's just a kid after all. But he'd still gone along with it. He'd still let those words leave his mouth, knowing full well what they could do to me. I couldn't stop picturing his face. The kid I'd helped raise, now forever associated with a lie that nearly shattered my life. The detective told me they'd follow up with my brother, but he couldn't guarantee anything. He said that even with my nephew's confession, it'd be tricky proving the extent of my brother's involvement, especially if he tried to deny it. I was furious, but also powerless. The thought that he might somehow dodge the consequences for all this made me feel sick. I thanked the detective, shook his hand, and left the station. I walked home in a daze, still trying to process everything. I felt like I was split in two. On one hand, I was relieved that my name was cleared, that the lie had been exposed. On the other, I was filled with rage and sadness. This was my family. My own flesh and blood had tried to ruin me for money. When I got home, I just sat there in silence, replaying every moment over and over. The relief of being proven innocent was there, but it was buried under layers of anger, betrayal, and hurt. I didn't know what to do next. All I knew was that things would never be the same again. After finding out the truth from the detective, I barely kept myself together. The fact that my brother had gone so far as to use his own son to frame me, it's hard to explain what that feels like. The shock, the anger, the betrayal, it all just hit me in waves. But at the core of it, I knew what I had to do. I had to confront him. There was no way I could let this slide without hearing his pathetic excuse for why he thought any of this was even remotely okay. I didn't even bother calling. I drove straight to his place, my mind racing the whole way. I kept thinking of every moment over the past few years, every time I'd helped him out, every dollar I'd given to make sure they were okay. And he turned around and did this? My blood was boiling, and I didn't even know what I'd say when I saw him. All I knew was that I needed answers. When I got there, he answered the door looking surprised but not scared, which somehow made me angrier. Here he was standing there like he hadn't just tried to ruin my life. I barely managed to hold myself back from exploding right then. Instead, I looked him dead in the eye and said, "We need to talk now." He tried to play it cool, giving me a fake smile and asking if I wanted to sit down like this was some kind of normal conversation. I wasn't having it. "Why?" I asked, cutting to the chase. "Why would you do this? Why would you push your own son to make up something that serious?" At first, he looked taken aback, like he hadn't expected me to be so direct. But then he recovered and gave me this tired, dramatic sigh. "Look," he said. "You don't understand how hard it's been. I'm a single father, and things have been really rough since your sister passed. You have money, and I don't." "And stop," I interrupted. I didn't want to hear his excuses. "You tried to ruin my life. You told your son to accuse me of something disgusting. Do you have any idea what you were doing?" He crossed his arms and looked away, acting all defensive. "I didn't have a choice," he muttered, still not meeting my eyes. "You're well off, and we're struggling. I was desperate, okay? Desperate people do desperate things." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Desperate people do desperate things? That's his reasoning? "You thought dragging my name through the mud was an okay solution because you were low on cash?" I practically yelled. "I've helped you every single time you've asked, and this is how you repay me?" He rolled his eyes, which only set me off even more. "Oh, please. You act like you've done so much for us, but a few handouts here and there don't exactly solve all my problems. I needed real help." "Real help?" I couldn't stop myself from laughing at how absurd this was. I've paid for groceries, clothes, school supplies, you name it. "How much help were you planning to milk me for?" He stayed silent, but his jaw was clenched, and he finally looked up at me clearly annoyed. "It's easy for you to say. You don't know what it's like struggling day in and day out. I thought if I could just scare you a little, maybe you'd finally give us what we actually need." "Scare me?" The word echoed in my head. "You wanted to scare me into handing over money by having your son accuse me of something unforgivable. Do you understand how messed up that is, or have you lost all sense of reality?" His face hardened, and he said, "It wasn't supposed to go this far. I thought you'd just pay up quietly, maybe feel bad enough to help us out long term. You have to understand. I didn't mean for it to get out of hand like this." "Get out of hand?" I could feel my pulse pounding in my temples. "You told your son to accuse me of a crime, a crime. Did you even consider what this would do to me or what it would do to him?" He looked away again, not saying anything. It was like he'd built up this wall around himself where nothing could get through. He had no remorse, no sense of the destruction he'd nearly caused. He just kept muttering about how tough his life was, as if that somehow justified everything. "I trusted you," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I trusted you, and I trusted him. I've tried to be there for you both ever since my sister passed, and you used that against me. You weaponized your own son to try to blackmail me. Do you even hear yourself?" He huffed, finally meeting my gaze with an indignant look. "Fine. Maybe it was a little extreme. But like I said, desperate times call for desperate measures." I shook my head, feeling a mix of anger and disgust that I couldn't put into words. "There's a difference between being desperate and being cruel," I said. "And what you did was downright cruel. You tried to ruin my life for money, and you dragged your own kid into it." He didn't respond, just crossed his arms and stared at the floor like some petulant child who'd been scolded. I realized then that nothing I said was going to get through to him. He convinced himself that he was the victim, that his actions were somehow justified because he was struggling. You know what? I finally said, unable to hold back the bitterness. We're done. Don't call me for money. Don't ask me for help. You're on your own from here on out. That seemed to snap him out of his sulk. He looked up, eyes wide, and started protesting. But what about my son? He needs stability. He needs a dad who doesn't use him as a weapon, I shot back. And you clearly aren't that. You've made it pretty clear that you're willing to use him as a pawn if it suits you. So, no, I won't be there to clean up your mess. He tried to guilt-trip me after that, saying I was being too harsh, that my nephew shouldn't suffer because of his mistakes, but I'd had enough. I told him I wasn't backing down, and I walked out. For the first time, I felt like I was actually breathing. The confrontation didn't give me any closure, though. If anything, I walked away feeling even more bitter. My brother-in-law had twisted things to make himself the victim, as if his struggles somehow justified everything he'd done. And the worst part was, he still didn't understand the damage he'd almost caused. I realized then that he didn't care about me or his son. He cared about getting what he wanted no matter what it cost. When I got home, I felt drained. I thought confronting him would bring me some kind of peace, but all it did was make me realize how deeply he'd betrayed me. It was like a switch had flipped, and I finally saw him for who he really was, a manipulative, selfish person who would do anything to get his way. I didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was clear. I couldn't trust him ever again, absolutely. This wasn't just for me. It was for my nephew too. That kid needed a wake-up call, something to show him that actions have consequences, even when you're being pressured by the person you trust most. And I hoped, maybe, it'd be a wake-up call for my brother-in-law as well. Though, honestly, I doubted he'd ever truly get it. The next few weeks were tense. The police had to go over everything again, take my statement in more detail, even ask me about past times I'd helped him financially. I had to drag up memories I tried to forget, and it was tough, but I kept reminding myself why I was doing it. I had to make sure this didn't happen to anyone else. I had to protect myself and anyone else who might have been his next target. Then, finally, the day came. The police showed up at his door and arrested him. I'll be honest. I didn't think I'd feel anything but relief, but the reality of it hit harder than I expected. This was still my family after all. My late sister's husband, my nephew's father, and now he was being taken away in handcuffs because of his own actions. But the thought of what he almost did to me, how close he'd come to wrecking my life, kept me grounded. This was on him. A few people heard about the arrest, of course. Family talk spreads like wildfire. I got calls from relatives asking what happened, telling me I was out of line, saying I should have just let it go. But I explained everything from the accusation to the blackmail. And for the most part, people started to see things my way. Some still thought I was harsh, but others were shocked, especially when they realized my brother-in-law had used his own son to try and get to me. One relative actually told me, "You're doing the right thing. People need to learn there are consequences." That gave me some comfort, knowing at least a few people understood where I was coming from. The day after his arrest, I found myself thinking about my nephew. I knew CPS would be involved now, that he'd probably be placed somewhere temporarily. Part of me felt responsible for him, guilty even. But then I remembered he'd been manipulated too. I couldn't protect him from the consequences of his actions, but maybe this would be his chance to see things clearly, to understand that his father's actions weren't okay. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, it still stung. I had cared for that kid, treated him like my own, and he'd gone along with his dad's scheme without any thought for what it would do to me. It's not something you just get over. In the weeks that followed, I focused on rebuilding, trying to get back to some kind of normalcy. But the whole experience had left its mark. I was more cautious now, more guarded. Family didn't mean the same thing it used to. I'd learned the hard way that loyalty can be one-sided, and people you trust can turn on you for reasons you'll never understand. When I look back on that decision to press charges, there's no regret. I did what I had to do. I protected myself, and maybe in a way, I helped my nephew too. I hope one day he'll realize that this was all because his father took advantage of both of us. I hope it's a lesson he'll never forget. In the days after my brother-in-law's arrest, I felt like I was in this weird in-between place. Part relief, part regret, and a whole lot of anger that hadn't really gone anywhere. My family was pretty divided over what had happened. Some people thought I was completely in the right, and others thought I'd gone too far pressing charges against him, that I should have just let it slide and moved on. It was funny in a way. Everyone had an opinion, but no one really understood what I'd been through. I tried not to let it bother me. At the end of the day, I knew why I'd done it. I couldn't let what he did go unpunished, not when he'd come so close to destroying my life. And honestly, I hoped it would teach my nephew a lesson too. But even knowing that, it didn't make things easier. My family, the people I thought I could count on, felt like strangers now. Going back to work was strange. For a while, I felt like I had this label stuck to me. Like, everyone could see what I'd been through even if they didn't know the details. I know it was all in my head, but I couldn't shake it. I was hyper aware of every interaction, wondering if people were thinking things or whispering behind my back. My boss and a few close friends knew what happened, and they were supportive, which helped. But it still felt like this heavy cloud was hanging over me. Every day, I'd replay everything in my mind, wondering if there was something I could have done differently. Could I have prevented this? Should I have been more cautious with my brother-in-law, maybe not been so trusting? It's weird. Up until this mess, I'd always believed in being generous, especially with family. But now I couldn't help but question all of it. Had I been naive? Too willing to help? I'd always seen myself as a good guy, but I started to realize that sometimes being the good guy just makes you an easy target. About a week after the arrest, I got a call from a family friend who'd heard bits and pieces of what went down. She told me that my nephew was staying in a temporary foster home, and I felt a pang of guilt I couldn't ignore. I knew he'd been manipulated, that his dad had put him in an impossible position, but that didn't erase the fact that he'd gone along with it. It's hard to look past that. Still, hearing that he was alone in a foster home hit me. No kid should have to go through that, even if they were part of something so messed up. Part of me wanted to reach out to offer some kind of support, maybe get in touch with him through CPS or see if there was a way I could check in. But every time I thought about it, I just felt this wall of anger go up again. I wasn't ready to forgive. Not yet. Maybe one day, but right then, the wounds were too fresh. And besides, I wasn't even sure what good it would do. He needed time to process everything, to understand the consequences of his actions, and I needed time to heal. Update: it had been a few months since everything had gone down with my brother-in-law. And for the first time in a while, I was beginning to feel like things were stabilizing. I'd put a lot of distance between myself and the whole mess, and while I still felt betrayed, I was getting better at managing it, at not letting it control my every thought. Life was finally starting to feel normal again, or at least as normal as it could after something like that. Then one afternoon, I got a call from an unfamiliar number. I almost didn't pick up. I'd been dodging random numbers for a while, figuring they were either telemarketers or family members trying to stir things up. But something about this one made me answer. The voice on the other end was calm, professional. "Hello? Is this my name?" "Yeah," I replied, still a bit guarded. "Who's this?" "This is Sarah from Child Protective Services. We have your nephew in our care and wanted to speak with you about a potential option." Hearing that, I felt a cold shock hit me, and I braced myself for whatever was coming next. She went on, explaining that my nephew had been in temporary foster care since my brother-in-law's arrest. Apparently, they'd reached out to other family members, but either they hadn't met the criteria or weren't interested in taking him in. So here they were, giving me a call to see if I would consider temporary custody. I don't know," I stammered, feeling a rush of emotions that I wasn't ready to face. "I'm not sure I'm the best option." Sarah was patient, letting me process everything. She explained that my nephew's case was complicated, that he'd been through a lot with his dad, and that his environment hadn't exactly set him up for success. She sounded understanding, even sympathetic, like she knew how loaded this was for me. And maybe she did. She'd probably handled cases like this before. "Look," she said after a moment. "I'm not saying you have to decide right now. This is a difficult situation, and I understand there's been a lot of conflict. But as a family member, you'd have a chance to provide some stability for him, even if it's just temporary." I told her I'd think about it, and we agreed to talk again in a couple of days. When I hung up, I just sat there staring at nothing, trying to wrap my head around it all. The idea of taking him in felt overwhelming. Part of me wanted to help him. He was just a kid, and he'd been through a mess of his own. But another part of me couldn't shake the hurt and betrayal of what he'd done, even if his mom had pressured him into it. The next couple of days were a whirlwind. I couldn't focus on work, couldn't really sleep either. The decision hung over me like a weight, making everything else feel insignificant. I kept going back and forth trying to weigh the options. On one hand, he was still my nephew. Despite everything that had happened, I'd watched him grow up. I remembered birthdays, holidays, the times I'd brought over gifts and groceries, knowing his mom was struggling to make ends meet. I cared about him as if he were my own son, and I couldn't deny that part of me still wanted to protect him, to make sure he had a shot at a decent life. I tried to convince myself that maybe in the right environment, he'd have a chance to grow beyond what his mom had done. But on the other hand, I couldn't forget what he'd done. The accusation, the investigation, the sleepless nights and constant anxiety, the feeling of being on trial in my own life, the way he'd looked at me with that cold, rehearsed gaze, saying things that had nearly destroyed me. It was hard to see him as an innocent kid after that, no matter how much I told myself he'd been manipulated. Part of me knew he was just a pawn, that he'd done what he was told, but that didn't erase the damage. My friends had mixed opinions. Some told me it wasn't worth reopening that wound, that it would be too painful, too risky to bring him into my life after what had happened. Others said maybe it was an opportunity to make a difference, that if I took him in, I could be the positive influence he needed to turn things around. But none of them knew what it felt like to have your whole life threatened by someone you thought you could trust. None of them had been through that level of betrayal. Finally, I agreed to meet with him. CPS arranged a supervised visit at their office, and I showed up, nervous and unsure of what to expect. When I walked in, he was sitting there looking smaller and more fragile than I remembered. His eyes flicked up to mine, and for a second, I saw a flash of fear, maybe even guilt. He mumbled hi, barely looking at me. I sat across from him unsure what to say. He looked different, more closed off, almost guarded. It was like he'd built up walls around himself, walls I wasn't sure I could break through. But then I realized I was doing the same thing. I was sitting there, my guard up, every instinct telling me to protect myself. I cleared my throat trying to start the conversation. "How are you holding up?" It was all I could think to say. He shrugged, not meeting my eyes. "It's okay, I guess, different." There was a pause, and then he added, barely a whisper, "I'm sorry." Hearing those words, I felt something tighten in my chest. I'd been waiting for an apology, hoping he'd own up to what had happened. But now that he'd said it, it felt hollow. Or maybe it was me that was hollow. I couldn't tell anymore. We sat there in silence, both of us awkward, unsure. When the visit ended, CPS asked if I'd come to a decision. I told them I needed a little more time. But on the drive home, I realized I already knew my answer. I wanted to help him. I really did, but I also knew that having him in my life under my roof would be a constant reminder of everything I'd been through. I'd always wonder if I could trust him, if he was really sorry, or just doing what he thought I wanted to hear, and that's no way to build a home. So a few days later, I called Sarah back and told her my decision. I wouldn't be taking him in. It wasn't an easy choice, and it definitely wasn't the one I'd imagined I'd ever have to make. But after everything, I needed to protect myself too. I hoped maybe that he'd find a place where he could learn from what had happened, where he could start fresh without the weight of his mom's mistakes hanging over him. It's hard to say goodbye to family, but sometimes you have to let go to move forward.